On Christmas night, her husband planned to humiliate her, until she entered, holding the hand of the most powerful man in the city. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. May every woman listening tonight be wrapped in peace, strength, and divine protection, because what you're about to hear will remind you that no pain lasts forever, and no betrayal goes unanswered. She gave him everything, her love, her loyalty, her dreams. But on the most beautiful night of the year, Christmas night, her husband planned to humiliate her in front of their friends, to prove he had power over her heart. He never imagined that same night would become the turning point of her life. Because when she walked into that glittering ballroom, wearing the same red dress he once mocked, she wasn't alone. Every camera turned, every whisper stopped. She held the hand of the most powerful man in the city, her husband's boss, the very man who had just discovered what her husband had done behind closed doors. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. Love turned to fire, humiliation turned to power, and that night she didn't just take back her pride, she took back her destiny. The emerald silk dress hung in the darkness of Julia Angel's closet, like a prayer answered in another lifetime. Its fabric still flawless despite the years. Despite everything that had died since Vernon Williams first fastened the delicate clasp at her neck and told her she looked like someone who belonged in his world. She stood before it now in the pre-dawn quiet, her fingers hovering over the silk without touching, afraid that contact might shatter the last fragile memory of when his love felt real instead of performed. That first anniversary dinner seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this moment not just by time, but by the slow erosion of everything she believed about forever. Julia had been 5 when the car accident stole her parents, leaving her orphaned and hollow in a world that suddenly made no sense. The Williams family took her in, their enormous estate becoming her home, their son Vernon becoming her reason to keep breathing through the grief. He was the same age, just a boy himself, but he held her hand through the funeral and whispered fierce promises that she would never be alone again. They grew up tangled together like vines, their childhood friendship deepening into something that felt inevitable, written into their bones before either of them had language for what love meant. When Vernon proposed at 23, Julia thought the universe was finally giving her back what it had stolen, a family that chose her, a home that could never be taken away. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized anymore, someone who had learned to make herself smaller year by year until she practically disappeared into the walls of this mansion. Her face was still beautiful in that way Vernon's mother Constance called pleasant enough, but her eyes held a wariness that had not been there in their wedding photos. She looked like someone bracing for impact, shoulders hunched against blows that might come from any direction. The breakfast table stretched between them like a canyon. Vernon seated at one end with his newspaper raised like a fortress wall. Julia set his coffee down with the silent precision of a ghost. The porcelain meeting, mahogany without sound, because she had learned that even small noises during his morning reading provoked that particular tightening around his mouth that preceded days of punishing silence. The coffee was exactly as he preferred it, 2 sugars dissolved completely, cream added until the liquid reached that specific shade of caramel he never thanked her for achieving. "Your mother called last night," Julia said softly, her voice barely disturbing the thick quiet of the dining room. "She wants to discuss the seating arrangements for the Christmas gala." Vernon turned a page with a sharp snap that made Julia's stomach clench. He did not acknowledge her words, did not lower the paper, did not give any indication that she had spoken. This was his newest cruelty, the withholding of basic recognition, treating her like ambient noise that required no response. She remembered when he used to wake her with kisses, pulling her close and murmuring plans for their future into her hair. Now he rose before dawn and left their bed cold. avoiding any accidental contact that might imply intimacy still existed between them. "Vernon?" She tried again, hating the pleading note that crept into her voice. "Your mother needs an answer by tonight. Then give her an answer," he said finally, his tone flat and dismissive. "You handle those things. That is what you do." The words landed with casual cruelty, reducing her to a function, a role, someone whose entire existence served to manage the tedious details of his life. Julia felt something crack inside her chest. Another small fracture in the foundation she kept trying to shore up with. Hope and patience, and the stubborn belief that the man she married still lived somewhere. "Beneath this cold stranger's skin," I thought. "We could decide together," she said, the words tasting like humiliation even as she spoke them. "It is our celebration." Vernon lowered his newspaper just enough to look at her over the top edge, and the expression in his eyes made her wish he had kept it raised. There was nothing there. No warmth, no irritation, no emotion at all. He looked at her the way someone might regard a moderately interesting insect. Briefly noted, then forgotten. "Julia, I have actual work to do today," he said with exaggerated patience, as though explaining something simple to someone slow. "The seating chart for Mother's party is not something that requires my attention. Handle it however you like. Put yourself at the children's table if that makes you happy." He stood then, folding his newspaper with mechanical precision and tucking it under his arm as he prepared to leave for whatever occupied his days. Meetings and lunches and a life that no longer included space for her except as background decoration. He walked past her chair close enough that she could smell his cologne, that expensive scent she used to bury her face against his neck to breathe in. And he did not pause, did not touch her shoulder, did not acknowledge her presence in any way that suggested she mattered. The front door closed behind him with quiet finality, and Julia sat alone at the breakfast table she had set for two, staring at his barely touched plate and feeling the vast emptiness of this house press down on her like physical weight. Constance Williams had been staying with them for 8 days now, and each morning brought fresh observations about Julia's inadequacies, delivered with the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum pain. The wrong flowers in the foyer, the inappropriate charity lunch she attended, the staff member who spoke too casually because Julia did not maintain proper boundaries, the fundamental wrongness of her presence in their family legacy. Julia cleared the breakfast dishes herself, needing the simple mechanical task to quiet the chaos in her mind. She had given Vernon everything, her loyalty, her dreams, her entire identity reshaped around his needs and his world. She had made herself into the perfect wife he claimed to want, anticipating his preferences, managing his household, representing his family name at society functions where women like Constance Williams judged her every word and gesture. And somehow it was never enough. She was never enough. The drive to Arnold Enterprises offered temporary escape, the city streets passing in a blur of morning light and traffic that required just enough attention to quiet the endless loop of questions in her head. What had she done wrong? When had Vernon stopped loving her? How did she fix something when she could not identify what had broken? Her desk outside Dan Arnold's corner office represented the only place where her efforts received recognition, where her work mattered beyond whether Vernon's coffee was the right temperature. Dan Arnold himself remained something of an enigma, his reputation for ruthless negotiations in direct contradiction to the gentleness he showed his employees. He remembered details about their lives that seemed impossible for someone managing an empire. He noticed when she stayed late and sent her home with instructions to rest. He looked directly at her when they spoke, actually seeing her in a way Vernon had stopped doing years ago. "Julia, I need you in my office," Dan's voice came through the intercom, carrying an unusual weight that made her pulse stutter with undefined dread. She smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the dark computer screen, making sure nothing about her appearance suggested the chaos churning beneath her careful composure. Dan's office door felt heavier than usual as she pushed it open. entering a space that smelled like leather and ambition and something else she could not name. Dan stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city sprawling beneath them like territory conquered through sheer force of will. He turned as she entered, and the expression on his face stopped her breath in her throat. She had never seen him look like this, grave and protective and furious all at once. "Close the door and sit down," he said quietly. "What I'm about to tell you will hurt, but you need to hear it from someone who cares, whether you survive what comes next." Julia's legs carried her to the chair across from his desk without conscious instruction, her body moving on autopilot while her mind raced through terrible possibilities. Dan returned to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a folder that looked thick with documents and photographs, evidence of something she instinctively knew would destroy whatever remained of her carefully constructed life. "Vernon came to see me 3 days ago," Dan began, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath each word. "He asked for my advice about how to end a marriage in the most publicly humiliating way possible. He wanted to know how to destroy someone so completely that they would have nothing left in our social circles." The room tilted sideways, air refusing to enter Julia's lungs properly as her brain struggled to process what she was hearing. Vernon wanted to humiliate her, not just leave her, not just end their marriage quietly, but demolish her in front of everyone who mattered in the world they inhabited together. "The Christmas gala," Dan continued, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "He plans to serve you divorce papers in front of 300 guests. He wants witnesses to your destruction, photographs that will circulate through every social media platform, proof of your complete devastation for everyone to consume." Julia's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, knuckles white with the effort of staying upright, while everything she believed about her life disintegrated into ash. Vernon, who had held her through her parents' funeral, who promised she would never be alone, who built his entire courtship on the foundation of being her safe place in a dangerous world, was now engineering her most complete annihilation. "There is more," Dan said, pushing the folder across his desk toward her. "Much more, and you need to see all of it before you make any decisions about what happens next." His eyes held something fierce and protective, a promise that she was not facing this alone, even though it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Julia reached for the folder with trembling fingers, knowing that opening it would end one version of her life forever and force the birth of someone new from the ashes of who she thought she was. She lifted the folder's cover, and the photographs inside showed her husband with another woman, their bodies intertwined in ways that left no room for innocent interpretation, his face expressing joy she had not seen directed at her in years. The world narrowed to those images, evidence of betrayal so complete it rendered every moment of their marriage a lie, and something inside Julia that had been bending finally snapped clean through. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake of her heart. "I need to know exactly what I am dealing with." Dan Arnold leaned forward, and in his eyes she saw not pity but respect, the recognition of someone who understood she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever given her credit for being. Chapter 2. The Evidence and the Invitation. The photographs spilled across Dan Arnold's desk like shattered glass, each image cutting deeper than the last. Vernon, with his arms wrapped around a woman whose blonde hair caught sunlight in ways that suggested expensive salons and generational wealth. Vernon kissing her neck at what looked like a yacht club, his hand possessive on her waist. Vernon emerging from a hotel suite, his tie loosened and his expression satisfied in ways Julia had not seen directed at her in years. The woman was Bellamy Ashford, daughter of the kind of old money that made even the Williams family seem like recent arrivals to wealth and privilege. Julia's hands remained steady as she examined each photograph, her mind disconnecting from her body in a strange floating sensation that felt like watching someone else's life implode. She recognized the hotel from a weekend Vernon claimed to be attending a conference. She recognized the yacht club from an afternoon he said was devoted to potential investors. She recognized the restaurant where he was supposed to be having dinner with his attorney. Every lie catalogued and documented, proof that her instincts had been screaming truth while her heart insisted on believing fiction. "How long?" Julia heard herself ask, her voice sounding distant and clinical. "How long has this been happening?" 18 months, Dan replied, his tone gentle despite the brutality of the information. "I have dated records, credit card receipts, phone logs. Vernon was not particularly careful about hiding it because he never imagined you would have access to someone who could compile this evidence." 18 months. A year and a half of Vernon coming home to her bed after leaving someone else's. A year and a half of calculated deception while she blamed herself for his distance, convinced that if she just tried harder, loved better, made herself more acceptable to his mother, everything would return to how it used to be. Dan slid another document across his desk, this one dense with typed text that Julia's eyes struggled to focus on. "This is the prenuptial agreement you signed before your wedding. Vernon's attorneys drafted it to ensure you would receive almost nothing in a divorce. They were very thorough about protecting the Williams family assets from what Constance called an unfortunate marriage." The words on the page blurred together, legal language designed to reduce her entire marriage to a transaction where she was the losing party. Julia remembered signing the papers in Constance's study, Vernon's hand warm on her shoulder as his mother explained that this was standard procedure, nothing personal, just protecting the family legacy that had taken generations to build. She had signed without reading carefully because she trusted Vernon completely, because she believed their love transcended money and contracts and family politics. "However," Dan continued, leaning forward with intensity burning in his eyes, "there is a clause buried on page 17 that Vernon's own attorneys apparently forgot existed. It states that in cases of proven infidelity, the agreement becomes void and standard divorce law applies. Vernon's affair destroys the very protection he thought would leave you with nothing." Hope flickered in Julia's chest for the first time since entering this office, a small flame struggling against the wind of her devastation. She looked up at Dan, really seeing him for the first time. This man who had apparently been gathering evidence and building a case, while she remained oblivious to both her husband's betrayal and this unexpected ally's protection. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question encompassing everything she could not articulate about his involvement, his care, his anger on her behalf. Dan was quiet for a moment, his expression shifting through emotions she could not name. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that suggested this answer mattered more than all the legal documents and damning photographs spread between them. "I have watched you for 3 years. Julia, I have seen you stay late to help employees who made mistakes, protecting them from consequences they deserved because you have a capacity for grace that this world does not appreciate. I have watched you bring coffee to the cleaning staff and learn their children's names and treat every person in this building like they matter. I've watched you dim your own light to avoid outshining your husband, making yourself smaller so he could feel bigger. And I have watched Vernon treat you like you are nothing, like you are disposable, like you are lucky to exist in his shadow." He stood and walked to the windows, overlooking the city, his shoulders tight with emotion he was clearly fighting to control. "I fell in love with you the day you stood between an executive and a janitor he was berating for a spilled coffee. You put your body between them and told that executive that if he had a problem with building maintenance, he could take it up with your boss, but he would not speak to another human being that way in your presence. You risked your job for someone who could not defend themselves, and I knew then that you were extraordinary." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. Julia's heart hammered against her ribs, her entire understanding of her place in the world shifting like tectonic plates beneath her feet. Dan Arnold, the most powerful man in their city, was telling her he loved her while her marriage crumbled into evidence spread across his desk. "I am still married," Julia said quietly, though even as she spoke the words, they felt hollow. What marriage existed beyond legal papers when respect and fidelity had long since died? "Vernon plans to end that tomorrow night," Dan replied, turning back to face her. "And I am offering you a choice about how that ending unfolds. You can let him humiliate you in front of everyone who matters, or you can walk into that gala on my arm and shift every power dynamic in the room before he has a chance to strike." Julia's mind raced through implications and consequences, imagining herself entering the Williams family Christmas gala with Dan Arnold beside her. Vernon's face when he realized his plan had been intercepted. Constance's fury at losing control of the narrative. The whispers that would spread through 300 guests like wildfire through dry grass. "Everyone will know," she said. Not quite a question, not quite a protest. "Everyone will see that you are not the helpless victim Vernon wants to display," Dan corrected. "They will see that you have allies with real power, that destroying you comes with consequences he never anticipated. They will see you standing with someone who values you instead of kneeling before someone who does not." He returned to his desk and sat down, his eyes never leaving her face. "I am not asking you to love me, Julia. I am not offering rescue or salvation or some fairy tale where I fix your life. I'm offering you partnership, respect, and the resources to fight back against people who believe you are too weak and too alone to defend yourself. What you do with that offer is entirely your choice." Julia looked at the evidence of her husband's betrayal scattered across Dan's desk, feeling the weight of 18 months of lies pressing against her chest. She thought about tomorrow night, about standing in her home while Vernon handed her divorce papers in front of everyone she knew, about becoming the entertainment at her own destruction. She thought about the emerald dress hanging in her closet, a ghost of better days that would never return. She thought about the girl who lost her parents and believed the Williams family was her salvation, not realizing she was trading one kind of orphan status for another. "If I walk in there with you," Julia said slowly, "there is no going back. Vernon will hate me. His mother will destroy whatever reputation I have left. I will become the villain in their story, the ungrateful charity case who betrayed the family that saved her. Or you become the woman who refused to be humiliated," Dan countered. "The woman who stood up instead of bowing down. The woman who discovered she was never the charity case, but always the prize her husband was too blind to value." Julia stood, her legs steadier than they had been when she first sat down. Something fundamental shifting inside her as she made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff with no certainty about what waited below. She gathered the photographs and documents, holding the evidence of Vernon's betrayal against her chest like armor. "What time should I be ready?" she asked, and her voice did not shake. Dan smiled, and it transformed his entire face from severe to warm, pride and admiration clear in his expression. "I will send a car at 7. And Julia, wear something that makes you feel powerful. Tomorrow night, you stop being Vernon Williams's apologetic wife and start being whoever you were always meant to become." Julia walked out of Dan's office with evidence that would change everything tucked under her arm. And for the first time in 18 months, maybe longer, she felt something besides despair stirring in her chest. It felt dangerous and reckless and completely terrifying. It felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. She drove home to the mansion she had tried so hard to turn into something warm, knowing that tonight would be her last night sleeping in the bed she shared with Vernon. The last night of pretending their marriage was something worth saving. Tomorrow she would walk into that gala and watch his carefully planned humiliation turn into his own exposure. And the thought should have filled her with fear, but instead sparked something that felt startlingly like joy. Constance Williams stood in the foyer when Julia entered, her expression cold and evaluating as always, looking at Julia like she was a stain on expensive carpet that required professional removal. "The caterer needs final numbers by tonight," Constance said without preamble. No greeting, no acknowledgement that Julia was anything more than staff. "And do try to wear something appropriate tomorrow." Simple and understated. This is a Williams family event, not an opportunity for you to draw attention to yourself. Julia looked at Vernon's mother, this woman who had spent years making her feel inadequate and unwelcome, and felt power surge through her veins like electricity. Tomorrow night, Constance Williams would understand exactly how much attention Julia could draw when she stopped trying to be invisible. "I will handle the caterer," Julia said calmly. "And I promise you, Constance, my outfit will be absolutely unforgettable." Chapter 3. The Transformation Decision. The mansion felt different tonight. Its grand rooms and expensive furnishings suddenly revealed as the gilded cage they had always been. Julia walked through halls she had once believed represented security and belonging, now seeing them as monuments to a family that never truly accepted her, walls built to keep people like her forever aware of their place. Vernon's study door stood partially open, light spilling into the darkened hallway, and she heard his voice drifting out, warm and animated in ways he never sounded when speaking to her. "I cannot wait to see you tomorrow night." "You darling," Vernon said, his tone dripping with affection that made Julia's stomach twist. "Everything is arranged perfectly. By midnight I will be free, and we can finally stop hiding what we mean to each other." Julia stood frozen in the hallway, listening to her husband discuss their divorce like it was a romantic milestone, a barrier between him and his happiness that would soon be demolished. She wondered if Bellamy Ashford knew about the public humiliation Vernon had planned, or if he had sold her a gentler version where Julia simply faded away quietly, grateful for the years she was allowed to play dress-up in a world above her station. "Mother is beside herself with joy," Vernon continued, laughing at something Bellamy said that Julia could not hear. "She has been planning how to introduce you properly to society as my wife, not hidden away like some shameful secret. You are everything she wanted for me, everything I should have chosen from the beginning, instead of letting childhood sentiment cloud my judgment." The words should have destroyed her, but instead they crystallized something that had been forming since she sat in Dan Arnold's office, surrounded by evidence of Vernon's betrayal. She was done breaking herself into smaller and smaller pieces, trying to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold her. She was done apologizing for existing, for breathing, for wanting to be treated like she mattered. She was done being the grateful orphan who owed the Williams family her entire identity in exchange for basic shelter and conditional acceptance. Julia walked away from Vernon's study without announcing her presence, climbing the stairs to their bedroom with new purpose burning in her chest. She stood before her closet, her hand reaching for the emerald silk dress that represented everything she thought their marriage was supposed to be, then stopped. That dress belonged to a different woman, someone who believed love was enough, who thought devotion could transform itself into belonging. That woman died somewhere in the space between Vernon's cold breakfasts and his warm phone calls to another woman. A knock on the bedroom door made Julia turn, expecting Vernon or his mother, but instead finding the housekeeper, Helen, standing in the doorway with an enormous white box in her arms. Helen had worked for the Williams family for decades, watching Julia grow from orphaned child to neglected wife, her dark eyes holding kindness that Constance's never would. "This arrived for you," Helen said softly, setting the box on the bed. "No name on the card, but I think you know who sent it." Julia lifted the lid with trembling fingers, tissue paper rustling as she uncovered a gown that stole her breath. Midnight blue fabric flowed like water, the cut simultaneously elegant and powerful, designed to make the woman wearing it impossible to ignore. Beside it lay a simple card in handwriting she recognized from signed documents and brief notes left on her desk. You were never the problem. You were always the prize he was too blind to see. Wear this tomorrow and show everyone who you really are. Dan. Julia lifted the gown from its box, holding it against her body as she faced the full-length mirror. The woman reflected back looked different somehow, stronger and more certain, like she was seeing her true self for the first time after years of distortion. This dress did not apologize or diminish. It commanded attention and refused to be overlooked. It was everything Constance Williams told her never to be. He is a good man, that Dan Arnold, Helen said quietly from the doorway. Better than most of the fancy people who come through these doors pretending their money makes them decent. He sees people for who they really are, not what they can do for him. Did you know, Julia asked, still staring at her reflection, about Vernon and Bellamy? Did everyone know except me? Helen's expression shifted to something sad and sympathetic. The staff always knows, Miss Julia. We see the hotel charges, the late nights that do not match his stories, the way he talks about you to his friends when he thinks we are not listening. But it was not our place to tell you, and honestly, we hoped you would leave on your own before it came to this. The admission hurt, despite Julia already knowing the truth. Confirmation that her humiliation had been observed and documented by people who could not intervene without risking their own livelihoods. She had been living in a house full of witnesses to her slow destruction, all of them powerless to stop it. I should have seen it, Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. All the signs were there and I just kept making excuses, kept believing that if I tried harder, loved better, made myself more acceptable to his family, he would remember why he married me. Love should not require you to shrink, Miss Julia, Helen replied, moving closer to stand beside her. Real love makes you bigger, stronger, more yourself. What you had with Vernon was not love. It was debt, obligation, and fear wrapped up in pretty words. You have been paying for your parents' death by erasing yourself, and that debt is not one you ever owed. The words cracked something open inside Julia, tears finally breaking through the numbness that had carried her through the afternoon. Helen wrapped her arms around her. This woman who was more family than Constance Williams ever pretended to be. And Julia sobbed against her shoulder for the girl who lost everything at 5. For the woman who spent 20 years believing gratitude and love were the same thing. For all the years she wasted trying to earn something that should have been freely given. Tomorrow night changes everything, Julia said when she could breathe again, stepping back to wipe her face. After tomorrow, there is no going back to who I was, no pretending Vernon and I can fix this, no more playing the role his family assigned me. Good, Helen said fiercely. That role was always too small for who you actually are. Time to show them what they lost by never bothering to look past their own prejudices and assumptions. After Helen left, Julia spent the night in the guest room down the hall, unable to sleep in the bed she shared with Vernon, unwilling to pretend for even one more night that their marriage was anything worth preserving. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios of tomorrow's gala, imagining Vernon's face when she walked in with Dan Arnold, Constance's shock at losing control of the narrative, the ripple of whispers spreading through guests who came expecting one show and would witness something completely different. Fear coursed through her veins alongside exhilaration, the twin sensations of terror and freedom, making her feel more alive than she had in years. She was about to walk into a room full of people who had watched Vernon treat her like she was nothing and reclaim her power in front of all of them. She was about to transform from victim into victor, from the grateful charity case into someone who refused to be diminished by people too small-minded to recognize her worth. Sleep finally came near dawn, and Julia dreamed of her parents for the first time in months. They stood in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright, their faces clear and loving, and her mother spoke words that felt like benediction and permission all at once. You were always meant to fly, baby girl. We are sorry you had to learn how from falling first, but look at you now. Look at how strong you became. Now spread those wings and show the world what we always knew you were. Magnificent. Julia woke with tears on her face and steel in her spine, ready to burn down everything she thought she wanted in order to build something true from the ashes. The emerald dress stayed in the closet, a ghost of who she used to be. Today, she would put on midnight blue and walk into her ending like it was her coronation. A queen reclaiming a throne she never knew was hers to begin with. Vernon never came looking for her that night, never noticed she slept in a different room, never cared enough to check if his wife was okay. The night before, he planned her complete destruction. And that indifference, more than anything else, told Julia everything she needed to know about the choice she was making. Tomorrow night, she would walk away from a man who never saw her and towards someone who had been watching her all along. Seeing value where others saw only obligation, the Christmas gala was hours away, and Julia Angel was done being apologetic about taking up space in rooms that should have welcomed her from the start. Chapter 4. The Gala Arrival. The afternoon light filtered through the guest room windows, casting shadows that danced across walls Julia had never truly examined before, despite living in this mansion for years. She sat at the vanity Helen had moved in that morning, watching herself transform under careful hands that belonged to the makeup artist Dan had sent without asking permission, understanding somehow that Julia would need support she could not request. The woman working magic with brushes and palettes moved with quiet efficiency, creating a version of Julia that looked powerful rather than pretty, striking rather than sweet. "You have incredible bone structure," the makeup artist murmured, stepping back to evaluate her work. "I cannot believe you have been hiding this face behind apologetic makeup and neutral colors. Tonight, you will walk into that room, and every person there will finally see what has been in front of them all along." Julia studied her reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Her eyes looked larger, more intense, lined with precision that made them impossible to ignore. Her lips wore deep red that refused to be dismissed. Her skin glowed with highlighted cheekbones that could cut glass. This was not the face of someone who begged for scraps of attention. This was the face of someone who demanded to be seen on her own terms. The midnight blue gown whispered against her skin as she stepped into it, the fabric settling onto her body like it had been designed specifically for this moment, for this transformation. Helen zipped her up with reverent care, her reflection in the mirror showing pride that made Julia's throat tighten with emotion. She refused to let ruin her carefully applied makeup. "Your parents would be so proud," Helen whispered, straightening the gown's shoulders. "Not because you are wearing an expensive dress to a fancy party, but because you finally stopped letting fear make you small. That takes more courage than most people ever find." A knock on the bedroom door announced Dan Arnold's arrival, and Julia's heart stuttered in her chest, nerves and excitement tangling together until she could not distinguish between them. Helen opened the door to reveal Dan in a midnight blue suit that matched her gown with intentional precision, the coordination a statement that they were presenting themselves as a united front. His expression when he saw her made something flutter in Julia's stomach. Appreciation so profound it felt like being truly valued for the first time in years. "You look absolutely magnificent," Dan said quietly, his voice carrying weight that had nothing to do with the expensive clothes and everything to do with finally being acknowledged as someone worth seeing. "Are you ready to walk into that room and rewrite the ending Vernon thought he was directing?" Julia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin in a posture that felt both foreign and natural, like she was remembering something she had forgotten rather than learning something new. "I have been ready my entire life. I just did not know it until yesterday." The drive to the Williams estate felt surreal. City streets decorated with Christmas lights blurring past the car windows, while Julia sat beside Dan, his presence solid and reassuring in the back seat of the town car. He had not touched her beyond offering his hand to help her into the vehicle, respecting boundaries even as they prepared to shatter social conventions together. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than tense. Two people sharing space without needing to fill it with nervous conversation. "Vernon is going to be furious," Julia said finally, watching the lights blur into stars outside her window. "He planned this whole evening around my humiliation, around serving divorce papers in front of everyone who matters in our social circle. Walking in there with you destroys his entire script." "Good," Dan replied, his voice firm. "Let him be furious. Let him understand that you are not the helpless victim he imagined, that destroying you comes with consequences he never anticipated. Men like Vernon have been getting away with cruelty disguised as privilege for too long. Tonight, he learns that some women fight back." The Williams estate appeared through the car windows, like something from a dream turned nightmare. Every detail designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. The circular driveway wrapped around an enormous fountain, water frozen mid-cascade into ice sculptures that caught the lights from 1,000 strategically placed bulbs. Luxury vehicles lined the drive, each one representing a family Vernon courted or competed with. Their presence tonight meant to witness what he believed would be Julia's complete social annihilation. Julia's hands trembled slightly as they approached, and Dan noticed, covering her fingers with his own warmth. "You do not have to do this. We can turn around right now, handle everything through attorneys, keep you far away from people who have spent years making you feel worthless." The offer was genuine. Escape route presented without judgment. But Julia shook her head. "If I turn around now, I let Vernon win. I let him tell whatever story he wants about why I was not here, about how I ran away because I knew I did not belong. I need to walk through those doors and show everyone, including myself, that I am done being afraid of his disapproval." The Williams estate blazed with light when they arrived. Every window glowing like the mansion itself was on fire. Christmas decorations transforming the grounds into something that would photograph beautifully for society pages. Valets stood at attention near the entrance, their eyes widening with recognition as Dan's car pulled up to the circular driveway. Julia felt her pulse quicken, adrenaline flooding her system as reality crashed over her. This was happening. In moments, she would step out of this car and walk into her own ending on her own terms, rewriting Vernon's planned humiliation into her declaration of independence. Dan stepped out first, then turned to offer Julia his hand, his grip steady and grounding as she emerged from the car. The valets stared openly, shock written across their faces because everyone in their social stratosphere understood what this meant. Dan Arnold arriving with Julia Angel, the woman they dismissed as Vernon Williams's charity case bride, represented a power shift that would ripple through every conversation happening inside those glowing walls. Julia took Dan's offered arm, her hand resting on expensive fabric covering solid muscle, and they walked toward the entrance together. Flash photography erupted around them as society reporters captured the moment, immortalizing the image of Julia in midnight blue beside the most powerful man in the city. Her expression confident rather than apologetic, her posture regal rather than submissive. She was no longer the grateful orphan or the neglected wife. Tonight, she was something entirely new, someone who refused to be defined by other people's limitations. They paused at the entrance, and Julia caught sight of herself reflected in the glass doors, a woman she barely knew wearing power like a second skin. Behind them, she heard whispers starting among the valets, phones already emerging to capture and broadcast this moment. By the time they crossed the threshold, half the city would know that Julia Angel had arrived at the Williams Christmas Gala on the arm of Dan Arnold, and the other half would find out before the first course was served. The massive oak doors swung open, revealing the grand foyer in all its orchestrated splendor. Towering arrangements of white roses and evergreen branches filled the space with competing fragrances that made Julia slightly dizzy. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across marble floors, polished to mirror shine. A string quartet played classical arrangements in the corner, their music barely audible over the buzz of 300 conversations happening simultaneously. The grand foyer fell silent as they entered, conversation dying in waves as 300 guests turned to witness the impossible. Julia felt every eye on her, assessing and calculating, social politics shifting in real time as people tried to understand what her arrival with Dan Arnold meant for their own alliances and positions. She recognized faces from countless society functions, women who had smiled at her with pity, men who had looked through her like she was invisible, families who whispered about the Williams boy and his unfortunate marriage to that orphan girl. Now those same people stared with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to barely concealed envy. A woman in emerald silk clutched her husband's arm and leaned close to whisper urgently. An elderly man in the corner dropped his champagne glass, the crash punctuating the silence. Two young socialites near the staircase had their phones raised, recording every second of this entrance that would define social conversation for months to come. Constance Williams stood near the base of the sweeping staircase, her face frozen in shock that melted into fury as she registered the coordinated midnight blue, the possessive way Dan's hand rested on Julia's lower back, the confidence radiating from the woman she had spent years trying to diminish. She wore pearls that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, and her fingers worried at the strand as though the beads might offer protection against what was unfolding before her. Julia met Constance's eyes across the foyer, holding her gaze without flinching or apologizing, and watched the older woman understand that everything had changed. The power dynamic that Constance had maintained through constant criticism and strategic humiliation had just inverted completely. Tonight, in front of everyone who mattered in their world, Julia was no longer the charity case desperately seeking approval. She was the woman who walked away and found something infinitely better. Vernon appeared in the archway leading to the ballroom, Bellamy Ashford draped on his arm like expensive jewelry, and the expression that crossed his face made Julia's breath catch. Shock, rage, and something that might have been fear warred for dominance as he stared at his wife standing beside the one man whose favor he had been desperately seeking, the man who could elevate or destroy the Williams family legacy with a single decision. Bellamy looked confused, her delicate features creased with uncertainty as she tried to read the tension suddenly crackling through the room. The walk across that marble floor felt like crossing a battlefield, every step deliberate and measured, her hand steady on Dan's arm as they navigated through guests who parted like water before them. Julia kept her head high, her expression serene despite the chaos of emotions churning in her chest. She was terrified and exhilarated, and more alive than she had felt in years, every nerve-ending firing with the awareness that this moment would define everything that came after. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Vernon hissed, crossing the foyer with predatory intent, Bellamy trailing behind, looking confused and uncomfortable. He stopped directly in front of Julia, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the vein pulsing in his temple that appeared when he was truly angry. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his carefully cultivated composure cracking to reveal the panic underneath. Dan's hand on Julia's back pressed slightly, a silent reminder that she was not alone, that she had backup if she needed it. But Julia found her voice without assistance, words rising from some deep place that had been silent for too long. "I am attending the Christmas gala," Julia said calmly, her voice carrying across the silent foyer with unexpected strength. "As a guest of Dan Arnold, is there a problem with that, Vernon?" Vernon's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Julia and Dan, clearly trying to recalibrate his plans on the fly. "We need to talk privately, right now." "I do not think we have anything to discuss privately," Julia replied, maintaining eye contact in a way she never had before, refusing to look away first, refusing to give ground. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of our guests." The challenge hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling, and Julia watched Vernon struggle with the implications. He had planned to control this evening, to orchestrate her humiliation with careful precision, but she had just seized the narrative and twisted it into something he never anticipated. His face darkened with fury, but before he could respond, Dan Arnold's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Actually, Vernon, perhaps we should discuss those proposals you sent over last month. The ones requesting a merger with my company to help shore up the Williams family portfolio. I have been meaning to give you my answer." Chapter 5, The Confrontation and the Revelation. Color drained from Vernon's face so rapidly, Julia wondered if he might actually faint in front of 300 witnesses, his carefully constructed composure crumbling like sandcastles against an incoming tide. She watched her husband's eyes dart to his mother, seeking guidance or rescue, finding only Constance Williams standing rigid with barely controlled panic, because Dan Arnold's words carried implications that extended far beyond tonight's social drama. "Perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more private," Vernon managed, his voice strained with false casualness that fooled no one paying attention. "I am sure our guests would prefer not to be bored with tedious discussions." "On the contrary," Dan replied smoothly, his hand never leaving Julia's back, "I think transparency serves everyone's interests in this situation. You contacted me seeking a merger that would inject substantial capital into Williams family holdings, correct? You presented financial statements suggesting a robust portfolio worth preserving and expanding." Vernon's jaw worked soundlessly, trapped between maintaining his public image and protecting secrets that were apparently about to be exposed. Bellamy Ashford shifted uncomfortably beside him, confusion written across her delicate features as she tried to understand why her evening was unraveling into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. "Those were preliminary discussions," Vernon said carefully, attempting to salvage control. "Nothing concrete had been decided." "You are absolutely right," Dan agreed, his tone conversational despite the steel underneath. "Nothing was decided because I had my team investigate the Williams family finances before committing resources to what appeared to be a sinking ship disguised as a luxury yacht. The numbers you provided do not match reality, Vernon. Not even close." The ballroom fell into absolute silence, guests pressing closer to hear every word of this unexpected confrontation. Julia felt surreal, watching Vernon's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Years of arrogant certainty dissolving under the weight of truth he thought buried deep enough to never surface. "I have no idea what you are implying," Vernon blustered, but his voice lacked conviction, his face betraying panic he could not quite mask. "The Williams family has maintained significant holdings for generations." "Had maintained," Dan corrected, his voice cutting through Vernon's protests with surgical precision. "Past tense. Your family burned through generational wealth with remarkable efficiency over the past decade. Bad property investments, lifestyle expenses that far exceeded income, loans taken against assets that were already leveraged beyond sustainability. The Williams empire is a facade maintained through credit and connections, but the foundation rotted away years ago." Constance Williams made a sound, somewhere between a gasp and a growl, her carefully maintained composure shattering as her family's carefully guarded secrets spilled into public consciousness. Guests whispered and photographed, social media lighting up with real-time updates about the Williams family's spectacular implosion, the scandal spreading like wildfire through networks that lived for exactly this kind of downfall. "You have no proof of these ridiculous accusations," Constance snapped, her voice shaking with fury and fear. You cannot come into our home and spread vicious lies designed to damage our reputation." Dan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a document that he unfolded with deliberate care, his expression neutral, despite the bomb he was clearly about to detonate. "This is a summary of financial records compiled by forensic accountants. It details falsified loan applications, inflated asset valuations, and tax irregularities spanning the last 7 years. Vernon has been presenting himself as financially secure while actively defrauding potential partners and investors." Vernon lunged forward, reaching for the document with desperation that confirmed its authenticity more clearly than any verbal admission. Dan stepped back smoothly, keeping the papers out of reach, while Julia stood frozen beside him. Watching her husband revealed himself as not just unfaithful, but fundamentally dishonest in ways that extended far beyond their marriage. "Where did you get those?" Vernon demanded, his voice rising with panic that attracted even more attention from guests who now had their phones raised, recording every moment for posterity and social media virality. "Those are private financial records. You have no legal right to access them." "I had every legal right once you formally requested a merger," Dan replied calmly. "Due diligence is standard procedure for any serious consideration. You invited this investigation the moment you asked me to invest in your family's holdings. What I found was fraud so extensive it warranted turning over my findings to appropriate authorities." The implications crashed over Julia like a physical wave, understanding, finally catching up to the reality unfolding around her. Vernon had not just betrayed their marriage. He had been committing crimes, risking everything on lies and manipulation, building a life on foundations that were always destined to collapse. She thought back to all the times he seemed stressed about money, the whispered phone calls with attorneys, the late nights in his study that she attributed to work pressure. He had been scrambling to keep his house of cards standing while planning her public humiliation, believing that destroying her would somehow solve problems that had nothing to do with their marriage. "You knew," Vernon said suddenly, his attention snapping to Julia with accusation burning in his eyes. "You knew about this and brought him here tonight to destroy me in front of everyone." Julia felt something shift inside her chest, the last remaining threads of connection to Vernon, severing cleanly as she recognized the man standing before her was a stranger who had always been a stranger. His childhood promises nothing more than tools of manipulation deployed by someone who viewed people as resources to be used rather than humans to be valued. "I knew you were planning to serve me divorce papers tonight," Julia said clearly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline making her hands tremble. "I knew you wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone who matters in our social circle. I knew about your affair with Bellamy, about the 18 months of lies while I blamed myself for your distance. What I did not know was the extent of your financial crimes, though I suppose I should not be surprised that your dishonesty extended beyond our marriage." Bellamy made a small sound of distress, her face pale as she processed the information about affair duration and Vernon's original plans for tonight. She looked between Vernon and Julia, clearly trying to reconcile the romantic narrative Vernon must have sold her with the ugly reality now on display. "You were going to serve her divorce papers tonight," Bellamy repeated, her voice small and uncertain. "You told me your marriage was already over, that you were just waiting for the right moment to make it official. You said it would be quiet and respectful. It appears Vernon's version of respectful differs significantly from most people's understanding," Dan observed dryly. He planned to have Julia served in front of 300 guests, ensuring her humiliation was witnessed and photographed for maximum social damage, destroying her reputation completely while elevating you as his new wife seemed to be the goal. Bellamy stepped away from Vernon like he had suddenly become toxic, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she understood how thoroughly she had been deceived. You told me she knew, that you had both agreed to end things amicably. You said she would not be at the gala tonight because she wanted to avoid awkwardness. Vernon reached for Bellamy's arm, attempting damage control, but she jerked away from his touch with visible disgust. Do not touch me. I will not be part of whatever sick game you are playing. My family has a reputation to protect, and I refuse to be associated with someone who treats people this way. She turned and walked toward the entrance with her head high, and Julia felt unexpected kinship with this woman she had considered her rival just hours ago. They were both victims of Vernon's manipulation, both deceived by someone who viewed relationships as transactions designed to benefit only himself. This is your fault, Vernon hissed at Julia, his mask finally dropping completely to reveal raw hatred underneath. I gave you everything. I took you in when you had nothing, made you part of my family, gave you a life you could never have achieved on your own. And this is how you repay me? By destroying everything I built? The accusation hung in the air, and Julia felt fury ignite in her chest, burning away the last remnants of self-doubt and misplaced guilt. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they stood face to face, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the silent ballroom with absolute clarity. You gave me nothing, Vernon. You took an orphaned child and turned her into a debt that could never be repaid. You made me believe that being chosen was the same as being loved, that gratitude and devotion were enough to earn basic respect. You spent years making me smaller so you could feel bigger, destroying my confidence so I would never question your treatment of me. But I am done shrinking for your comfort, done apologizing for existing, done accepting crumbs of affection from someone who never valued what he had. Chapter 6. The Alliance and the Dissolution. The applause started somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a single person clapping slowly before others joined in. The sound building into something that felt like validation and vindication all at once. Julia stood in the center of the foyer, with her chest heaving from emotion finally released, watching Vernon's face cycle through shock and rage as he realized the room was applauding her words, celebrating his exposure rather than mourning his downfall. Constance Williams looked like she had aged a decade in the span of minutes, her carefully constructed social armor cracking to reveal the desperate fear underneath. Get out, Vernon said, his voice low and venomous. Get out of my house right now. Your house, Julia repeated, and she heard herself laugh, the sound surprising her with its genuine amusement despite the chaos swirling around them. Vernon, this stopped being your house the moment Dan's investigation revealed you do not actually own it anymore. How many mortgages are stacked against this property? How much debt are you carrying while pretending to be the heir to generational wealth? Dan stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without requiring volume or aggression. The divorce papers Vernon planned to serve tonight would have left Julia with nothing, relying on a prenuptial agreement designed to protect William's family assets. However, that prenuptial agreement contained a clause about infidelity that Vernon's own attorneys apparently forgot existed. His affair voids the agreement completely, making Julia entitled to equitable distribution under standard divorce law. I will fight this, Vernon threatened, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. I will drag this through courts for years. Make sure you regret ever crossing me. You are welcome to try, Dan replied mildly, though I should mention that my legal team has already filed paperwork on Julia's behalf. By Monday morning, restraining orders will prevent you from dissipating any remaining assets, and forensic accountants will be going through every transaction you have made in the past decade. Given what we have already found, I imagine criminal charges are inevitable. The room erupted into chaos as guests absorbed the full scope of the scandal unfolding before them, conversations exploding into excited speculation and shocked commentary. Julia felt Dan's hand at her elbow, gently guiding her toward the entrance, extracting her from the wreckage of her old life with practiced efficiency. She walked past Constance Williams without a word, past Vernon, standing alone in the center of his crumbling empire, past 300 witnesses who would spend the next weeks dissecting every moment of this evening. The night air hit Julia's face like a blessing as they emerged from the suffocating atmosphere of the Williams estate. December cold shocking her system back into something approaching normal function. Dan's car waited at the entrance, and he handed her into the back seat with the same careful attention he had shown all evening, his presence solid and grounding while everything else spun out of control. "Are you all right?" Dan asked once they were moving. His voice gentle in the darkness of the car. Julia considered the question, examining her internal landscape for damage and finding instead something that felt surprisingly like relief. "I should be devastated. My marriage just imploded publicly. My husband was exposed as a criminal and a liar. Everyone I know just witnessed the complete destruction of the life I thought I had built. But all I feel is free, like I just escaped from a prison I did not realize I was living in until the door finally opened." Dan smiled, real warmth transforming his usually serious expression. "That is because you are finally seeing the truth clearly. Vernon never loved you, Julia. He kept you trapped in gratitude and obligation, making you believe you owed your entire existence to a family that should have been honored to have you. Tonight you stopped paying a debt you never actually owed." They drove through city streets decorated with holiday lights. The contrast between festive cheer and personal upheaval making Julia feel surreal and disconnected from ordinary reality. Dan's penthouse appeared in the skyline ahead of them, glass and steel, rising above the city like a monument to success, achieved through actual merit rather than inherited pretense. "I have a guest suite prepared for you," Dan said as they pulled into the private garage beneath his building. "Stay as long as you need while we sort through the divorce proceedings and figure out your next steps. You are not alone in this, Julia. Whatever comes next, you have resources and support." The penthouse took Julia's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city spread beneath them like conquered territory. Every detail reflecting taste and quality without the ostentatious display that characterized the Williams mansion. This space felt earned rather than inherited, built through intelligence and hard work rather than maintained through lies and depleting trust funds. Dan poured whiskey into crystal glasses, handing one to Julia before settling into the chair across from where she stood at the windows. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without feeling pressured or obligated in any way." Julia turned to face him, her heart hammering with anticipation and nerves tangled together until she could not distinguish between them. Dan looked at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and valued simultaneously, like he was seeing straight through every defense she had ever built. "I have been in love with you since the day you stood up for that janitor, putting yourself between him and an executive who could have ended your career with a single complaint. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, but you refused to let someone be diminished simply because they held less power. I watched you bring coffee to cleaning staff and learn their children's names, treating every person you encountered like they mattered regardless of their position. I watched you stay late helping colleagues avoid mistakes, protecting people who never thanked you or even acknowledged your help." He stood and crossed to where she waited at the windows, stopping just close enough that she could feel his warmth without touching. "I watched Vernon treat you like you were nothing, saw you dim your own light to avoid outshining him, and it took everything in me not to intervene before tonight. But you needed to choose yourself first, needed to decide that you deserved better before I could offer you anything beyond employer and ally." Julia's throat tightened with emotion, tears threatening carefully applied makeup as Dan's words washed over her like absolution. "I am still married, legally if not emotionally. Vernon will make the divorce as ugly as possible out of spite. I come with nothing but debt and scandal and a social reputation that just got demolished in front of everyone who matters." You come with strength, intelligence, grace, and a capacity for kindness that this world desperately needs, Dan countered. Everything else is just logistics we can handle together if you choose to let me be part of whatever comes next. I'm not offering rescue, Julia. I'm offering partnership with someone I respect and admire. Someone who has proven she can survive anything and emerge stronger. The declaration hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk, and Julia felt something shift in her chest. The first stirrings of what love might feel like when based on respect rather than obligation. She reached up and touched Dan's face, her fingers tracing his jaw with tentative wonder. And when she spoke, her voice carried certainty she had never felt with Vernon. I do not know how to be in a relationship where I am not constantly trying to earn my place. I do not know how to accept care without viewing it as debt that needs repayment. Vernon trained me to believe love requires sacrifice of self, constant vigilance against disappointing someone, endless work to maintain conditional acceptance. Dan covered her hand with his, turning his face to press a kiss against her palm. Then let me teach you something different. Let me show you what it feels like to be valued rather than tolerated, chosen rather than accepted, celebrated rather than endured. We will figure it out together, at whatever pace feels right to you, with no pressure and no expectations beyond honesty and mutual respect. Julia let herself lean against him, feeling his arms come around her with careful strength. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe without feeling trapped. Dan's heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, his presence solid without being suffocating, his care offered without strings attached or debts accrued. They stood together at the windows overlooking the city, while somewhere across town Vernon dealt with the wreckage of his own making, while Constance scrambled to salvage a reputation that was already beyond repair. While 300 guests spread the story of the Williams family's spectacular downfall across every social media platform and private conversation. Tomorrow would bring legal battles and public scrutiny and complications Julia could not yet imagine. But tonight she was free, standing in the arms of someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway, feeling the first stirrings of hope that maybe, just maybe, her life was finally beginning instead of ending. Chapter 7. The Rising and the Reckoning. Morning light filled Dan's penthouse with golden warmth, and Julia woke in the guest suite feeling disoriented until memory crashed over her like a wave. The gala, Vernon's exposure, her public confrontation, the end of everything she thought her life was supposed to be. She expected to feel devastated, broken by the loss of her marriage despite its toxicity. But instead she felt something closer to exhilaration, like she had been holding her breath underwater for years and finally broke the surface, gasping for air that filled her lungs with possibility. Her phone sat on the nightstand where she had left it, and when she finally gathered courage to look at the screen, she found hundreds of notifications waiting. Text messages from people she barely knew, emails from acquaintances she had not spoken to in years, social media mentions that seemed to multiply even as she scrolled through them. The Williams family Christmas gala had become the most talked about event of the season, video clips and photographs circulating with commentary that ranged from supportive to vicious to merely curious. Most surprising were the messages from women thanking her for speaking truth they recognized in their own lives. Wives of powerful men who understood what it meant to make yourself smaller, to accept cruelty disguised as love, to stay trapped in situations that slowly destroyed you from the inside. They wrote about watching her confrontation with Vernon and feeling something shift in themselves, permission to imagine different endings to their own stories. I wondered if you would sleep through the morning. Dan's voice came from the doorway, and Julia looked up to find him holding coffee, already dressed in casual clothes that somehow made him look more approachable than his usual tailored suits. The internet has opinions about last night, most of them surprisingly favorable toward you. Julia accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup like an anchor to present reality. I thought I would be vilified as the ungrateful charity case who betrayed the family that saved her. Constance Williams has spent years building that narrative. Constance Williams spent years underestimating how many people see through her pretensions, Dan replied, settling into the chair near the bed with his own coffee. The old guard of society might clutch their pearls about propriety and loyalty, but everyone else recognizes courage when they see it. You stood in front of 300 people and refused to be diminished. That resonates with more people than you realize. A knock on the penthouse door interrupted their conversation, and Dan rose to answer it, returning moments later with his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who carried herself like someone accustomed to winning battles most people did not even know were being fought. She settled onto the sofa with a briefcase full of documents, her expression serious but not unkind as she directed her attention to Julia. "We have a lot to discuss," Patricia began, spreading papers across the coffee table between them. "Vernon's attorneys have already filed multiple motions attempting to delay proceedings and protect remaining assets. They are arguing that your arrival at the gala with Dan constitutes abandonment of the marital home, which is absurd given Vernon's documented infidelity and his stated intention to serve you divorce papers that same evening." Julia listened as Patricia outlined the legal strategy, explaining how Vernon's own recorded conversations and documented affair destroyed the prenuptial agreement he thought would protect him. The Williams family was scrambling to hide assets, transferring property titles and draining accounts, but Dan's forensic team had been tracking their movements for weeks, documenting every desperate attempt to avoid accountability. "The best part," Patricia said with grim satisfaction, "is that Vernon's financial fraud investigation is moving forward regardless of the divorce proceedings. Federal agencies are examining tax returns, loan applications, and investment claims. His attempt to defraud potential partners by misrepresenting his financial position falls under multiple criminal statutes." The walls were closing in on Vernon Williams, the empire he pretended to inherit crumbling under the weight of lies that could no longer be sustained. Julia should have felt satisfaction or vindication, but mostly she felt exhausted by the waste of it all. Vernon had everything: a wife who loved him, a comfortable life, opportunities most people never imagined. And he destroyed it all through arrogance and cruelty and the belief that some people existed solely to serve his needs. Days blurred into weeks as Julia navigated the strange new reality of her life. She stayed in Dan's guest suite while divorce proceedings advanced through the courts, Vernon fighting every step with a desperation that bordered on pathetic. He called constantly, leaving voicemails that progressed from demanding to pleading to threatening, his voice revealing panic as he watched his world disintegrate. Constance attempted intervention, appearing at Dan's building demanding an audience, offering money and influence and anything that might make the scandal disappear. Julia refused to see her, refused to engage with the woman who spent years making her feel inadequate and unwelcome. Patricia handled all communication, responding to legal maneuvers with devastating precision, using Vernon's own documented behavior against him at every turn. The prenuptial agreement that was supposed to leave Julia destitute instead became worthless. Vernon's infidelity voiding protections, his family thought ironclad. "The judge wants to see you both in chambers," Patricia informed Julia during one of their regular strategy sessions. "She is known for cutting through nonsense and getting to the heart of matters. This could be where we settle major terms." The courthouse felt surreal, its marble halls and formal atmosphere a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of divorce. Julia walked beside Patricia, her spine straight and her expression calm despite nerves making her hands shake. Vernon waited outside the judge's chambers with his attorneys, looking haggard in ways expensive clothes could not hide. Weight loss made his suits hang strangely. Exhaustion carved lines into his face that had not been there months ago. and his eyes, when they met Julia's, held something that might have been regret if she thought him capable of genuine emotion. "Can we talk?" Vernon said quietly, stepping away from his attorneys toward where Julia stood. "Just for a moment, please." Patricia tensed beside her, clearly ready to intervene, but Julia nodded agreement. Vernon led her down the hall to a window overlooking the city, far enough from their attorneys to have semblance of privacy while remaining in public view. "I know I destroyed everything," Vernon began, his voice rough with emotion that sounded almost genuine. "I know I treated you terribly, betrayed every promise I made, planned your humiliation like it was entertainment. I cannot explain why I became the person who could do those things to someone I once loved." "You never loved me," Julia said simply, the words carrying no heat or accusation, just statement of fact she had finally accepted. "You loved the idea of saving me, the gratitude you thought I owed you, the control you had over someone dependent on your family's charity. When I started wanting things for myself, when I stopped being grateful enough, I became inconvenient rather than convenient." Vernon flinched at the assessment, unable to deny truths laid bare between them. "I'm going to lose everything. The house, the family reputation, probably my freedom when the criminal charges are finalized. I will be lucky to avoid prison. That is not my problem to fix," Julia replied, keeping her voice steady despite unexpected pity stirring in her chest. "You made choices, Vernon. You chose cruelty over kindness, lies over honesty, destruction over building something real. These consequences belong to you." "I am sorry," Vernon whispered, and tears actually tracked down his face, genuine or performed she could not tell and no longer cared to determine. "For whatever it is worth now, I am truly sorry for every way I hurt you." Julia looked at the man she married, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their entire relationship. He was not a villain in some dramatic story, just a flawed human who chose badly again and again until those choices left him alone and broken. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering, no joy in his downfall, just weariness at the waste of it all. "I hope you find peace someday, Vernon. I hope you learn to value people before you lose them, rather than after. But I cannot be part of your journey toward redemption. That work is yours to do alone." She walked back to where Patricia waited, leaving Vernon standing at the window, and did not look back. The judge's chambers were severe and professional, her sharp eyes assessing Julia, and Vernon with the practiced evaluation of someone who had witnessed countless marriages dissolve into their component parts of hurt and resentment and property division. The settlement negotiations were brutal and efficient, Patricia advocating for Julia with fierce precision, while Vernon's attorneys tried desperately to salvage something from the wreckage. In the end, Vernon agreed to terms far more generous than his original prenuptial agreement would have allowed, desperation making him cooperative in ways arrogance never would have permitted. Julia would receive substantial assets, enough to live comfortably independent of anyone's charity, enough to start fresh without the weight of financial vulnerability pressing on her chest. Walking out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight, officially separated from Vernon Williams, with divorce finalization just weeks away, Julia felt the last chains fall away from her ankles. Chapter 8. The Media Storm and the Transformation. The story exploded across every platform imaginable, morphing from society scandal into something larger that captured public imagination in ways no one anticipated. Morning Talk shows devoted segments to analyzing the Williams family gala, relationship experts and social commentators dissecting every aspect of what transpired. Julia's name trended alongside hashtags about empowerment and standing up to manipulation. Her confrontation with Vernon replayed millions of times by people who saw their own struggles reflected in her words. Interview requests flooded in from major networks. Magazines and podcasts, everyone wanting the exclusive story of the woman who stood up to old money privilege and won. Patricia advised caution, warning that public attention cut both ways, but Dan encouraged Julia to tell her story on her own terms rather than letting others control the narrative. After careful consideration and multiple strategy sessions, Julia agreed to one major primetime interview with a respected journalist known for fairness rather than sensationalism. The studio felt surreal with its bright lights and multiple cameras, makeup artists and producers fussing over details while Julia sat in the guest chair trying to calm nerves that made her stomach flutter. The interviewer, a woman whose career had been built on asking difficult questions with genuine empathy, settled across from her with the kind of focused attention that suggested this conversation would matter beyond entertainment value. "Thank you for sitting down with us," the interviewer began once cameras were rolling. "Your story has resonated with millions of people, particularly women who see themselves in your experience. Let's start with the question everyone wants answered. What gave you the courage to walk into that gala with Dan Arnold, knowing you were about to detonate your entire life?" Julia took a breath, gathering thoughts she had been processing for weeks, understanding that how she framed this moment would define public perception going forward. "I did not feel courageous. I felt terrified and desperate and completely out of options. My husband was planning to humiliate me publicly, and I discovered that everything I believed about our marriage was a lie. Walking in with Dan was not some calculated power move. It was survival instinct, choosing to face destruction on my own terms rather than letting Vernon orchestrate it for his amusement." The interview progressed through questions about her childhood, losing her parents, being taken in by the Williams family, the slow erosion of her marriage into something toxic that she could not name or escape. Julia spoke with careful honesty, never sensationalizing or exaggerating, letting the simple truth carry its own weight. She described the breakfast table silences, the constant criticism from Constance, the way Vernon made her feel like an intruder in her own home, despite years of marriage. "There is a pattern in the Williams family history that disturbs me deeply," the interviewer said, leaning forward with intensity that suggested this was the question she had been building toward. "Our research team discovered that you were not the first young black woman taken in by the Williams family. Over 3 generations, they have a documented pattern of bringing in orphaned or vulnerable girls, raising them alongside their sons, marrying them, then discarding them when they no longer served family purposes. You were part of a cycle that has destroyed multiple women before you." The revelation hit Julia like physical impact, her mind reeling as implications cascaded through her understanding of her own story. She was not unique or special or even particularly unlucky. She was the latest in a long line of women used and discarded by a family that viewed compassion as currency and gratitude as ownership. The pattern made sickening sense, explaining Constance's practiced cruelty. Vernon's entitled belief that Julia owed him everything. The ease with which they planned her destruction. "I did not know that," Julia said slowly, her voice shaking with fury and grief for all the women whose stories paralleled her own. "But it explains so much about how they viewed me. I was never really family to them. I was a project, a charity case, someone they could point to as evidence of their generosity, while using me to make Vernon feel powerful and benevolent." The interview went viral before it finished airing. Clips spreading across social media with commentary from women sharing their own stories of relationships where they were made to feel grateful for basic respect, where love required constant diminishment of self, where leaving felt impossible because they had internalized the narrative that they were lucky to be chosen at all. Julia's refusal to soften her truth or protect Vernon's reputation resonated with audiences tired of watching powerful men face no consequences for cruelty disguised as romance. Dan watched from backstage, And when the cameras stopped rolling and Julia finally stood on shaking legs, he was there to catch her, his arms solid and grounding, while she processed what she had just done. She had exposed her pain to millions of strangers, made herself vulnerable in ways that could not be taken back, turned her private devastation into public testimony. Part of her wanted to take it all back, retreat into privacy and safety. But a larger part felt exhilarated by finally telling the truth, without filtering it through fear of Vernon's reaction or concern for the Williams family reputation. "You were magnificent," Dan murmured against her hair, holding her close while studio staff bustled around them breaking down equipment. "Honest and powerful and completely yourself. Every person watching just saw exactly what I have been seeing for years. Someone extraordinary, who spent too long letting other people dim her light." The weeks following the interview transformed Julia's life in ways she could not have predicted. Women reached out, sharing their stories, asking for advice, seeking hope that escape was possible. Domestic violence organizations invited her to speak, recognizing that her story represented emotional abuse patterns that too many people failed to recognize until they were deeply trapped. She stood at podiums in community centers and college campuses, telling audiences that love should not require you to shrink, that healthy relationships expand rather than constrain, that leaving takes courage, but staying in situations that destroy you takes even more. Vernon's criminal trial date was set, federal charges proceeding despite his attorney's best efforts to delay or dismiss. The evidence Dan's team had compiled was damning and thorough, painting a picture of fraud spanning years, affecting investors and partners who trusted the Williams family name without verifying the actual assets behind the reputation. Constance Williams appeared at several court hearings, her face carved into lines of bitter fury, her empire crumbling around her while she watched powerless to stop it. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday morning with minimal fanfare, a judge signing papers that officially ended Julia's marriage to Vernon Williams and returned her legal independence. She walked out of the courthouse no longer Mrs. Williams, no longer tied to a family that never truly accepted her, free to build whatever life she wanted without obligation or debt to anyone. The settlement provided financial security, enough that she would never again have to depend on someone else's generosity or tolerate cruelty because she needed their resources. Dan took her to dinner that night at a quiet restaurant far from cameras and social media attention. Just the two of them in a corner booth where they could talk without performance or pretense. They had been living in careful proximity for months now, their relationship existing in a strange space between employer and employee, between friends and something more, neither willing to push too hard too fast, while Julia was still technically married and processing trauma. "I want to offer you something," Dan said over dessert, his expression serious in ways that made Julia's heart race with anticipation and nerves. "Not a job, though that offer still stands if you want it. Not a relationship, though that door is open whenever you feel ready to walk through it. I want to offer you partnership in creating something that matters, using resources and influence to help women escape situations like yours before they lose years of their lives to people who do not value them." He slid a folder across the table, and inside, Julia found plans for a foundation dedicated to supporting women leaving abusive relationships, providing legal resources and financial assistance and community that could replace the isolation abuse thrived in. Dan had outlined potential programs and funding sources, but left blank spaces where Julia's vision could shape direction and priorities. "I want you to build this with me," Dan continued, his voice carrying weight that had nothing to do with money or power and everything to do with genuine belief in her capacity. "Not as my employee or assistant or someone executing my vision, as my equal partner, someone whose experience and insight are invaluable, someone who understands what these women need because you lived it." Julia stared at the folder, feeling tears blur her vision as she processed what Dan was offering. Not rescue or salvation or another version of owing someone for basic opportunities. Partnership, collaboration, a chance to transform her pain into purpose and her survival into something that could help others. She looked up at Dan, seeing him clearly without the fog of trauma and transition that had colored every interaction since that first conversation in his office. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to building this foundation together. Yes to whatever comes next with you. Yes to finally allowing myself to imagine a future that is not defined by what Vernon took from me, but by what I choose to create." Dan's smile transformed his entire face, and when he reached across the table to take her hand, Julia let herself feel the warmth of connection without analyzing whether she deserved it or worrying about invisible strings attached. Chapter 9. The Foundation and the Future. The foundation took shape in a restored brownstone near the community center, where Julia had spent so many Saturdays teaching young women to value themselves. The building's history of housing families escaping difficult circumstances, feeling symbolically appropriate for its new purpose. Julia threw herself into the work with passion she had never been allowed to express in her marriage. Designing programs and hiring staff and creating systems to help women navigate the complicated process of leaving relationships that had convinced them they were nothing without their partners. Dan watched her flourish with obvious pride, never inserting his vision over hers, never making her feel like she needed his approval for decisions she was fully qualified to make. Their working relationship evolved into genuine partnership. Hours spent debating strategies and refining approaches, challenges tackled together rather than her solving problems alone while trying not to bother him. For the first time in her adult life, Julia understood what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than tolerated despite it. The Foundation's opening gala was everything the Williams Christmas party was not. An evening celebrating survival and strength rather than displaying wealth and privilege. Women who had escaped abuse spoke about their journeys. Staff outlined programs that would provide legal representation and financial counseling and community support. Julia stood at the podium in a dress the color of sunrise, her voice steady as she told her own story one more time, understanding that repetition served purpose even when exhausting. "I thought love required sacrifice," Julia said to the crowded room. "I believed that being chosen meant being grateful, that devotion was measured in how much of yourself you were willing to erase to make someone else comfortable. I spent years shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold me fully, apologizing for needing things that all humans deserve. Respect, honesty, care that does not come with conditions attached. Tonight, we launch something that I wish had existed when I needed it most. A place where women can find resources without judgment, support without strings. Community that reminds them they were never the problem." The applause that followed felt different than the night of her confrontation with Vernon. Warm rather than shocked, celebratory rather than scandalized. These were people who understood the courage required to leave, the strength necessary to rebuild, the grace to transform pain into purpose instead of letting it poison your future. Among the first women to walk through the Foundation's doors was a young mother named Rachel, who arrived with 2 small children and nothing but the clothes they wore. Her husband had controlled every aspect of their lives, monitoring her phone, isolating her from family, convincing her that she was too stupid and unstable to survive without him. She sat in Julia's office that first day, hands trembling as she tried to explain her situation through tears, convinced that leaving made her weak rather than brave. "I kept thinking about what you said in that interview," Rachel whispered, her youngest daughter asleep in her lap, "about how love should not require you to shrink. My daughter is 5 now, the same age you were when you lost your parents. I looked at her yesterday and realized I was teaching her that this is what love looks like, that women apologize for breathing, that we accept cruelty because we are grateful someone chose us. I could not let her learn those lessons." Julia worked with Rachel for months, connecting her with attorneys who secured restraining orders, financial counselors who helped her budget the settlement she fought for, therapists who specialized in trauma recovery. She watched Rachel transform from someone who apologized for existing into someone who enrolled in college courses and landed a job that gave her independence she had never imagined possible. The foundation paid for childcare while Rachel attended classes, ensuring that leaving her abuser did not mean sacrificing her future. 6 months after Rachel walked through their doors, Julia received a text message with a photograph attached. Rachel stood in cap and gown at her college graduation, her daughters on either side, wearing matching smiles, and the caption read simply, "Thank you for teaching me that I was always strong enough. I just needed someone to believe it before I could." Julia kept that photograph on her desk as reminder of why the work mattered, why every grant proposal and fundraising event and exhausting speaking engagement served purpose beyond her own healing. Rachel was one of hundreds, each with their own story of survival, each finding their way to the foundation when they had nowhere else to turn. Vernon's criminal trial concluded during the Foundation's first month of operation. Guilty verdicts on multiple counts of fraud, delivering consequences his family connections could not deflect or dismiss. He stood in the courtroom looking diminished and defeated, sentenced to years in federal prison that would strip away the last remnants of the life he thought guaranteed by birth and breeding. Julia attended the sentencing hearing at Patricia's suggestion, closure ritual that would mark the final end of her connection to the Williams family. Vernon turned to look at her before being led away, and in his eyes she saw genuine remorse mixed with resignation that he had destroyed his own life through choices no one forced him to make. Julia felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no vindication in watching him face accountability. She felt only tired relief that this chapter was finally closing, allowing her to move forward without constantly looking over her shoulder for the next attack or manipulation. Constance Williams lost everything that mattered to her, social standing evaporating as the Williams family history of exploitation became public knowledge, friends abandoning her with the same casual cruelty she had shown to Julia and countless women before her. The mansion was seized to pay restitution, family treasures auctioned off to compensate victims of Vernon's fraud. Constance moved into a modest apartment, her glory days reduced to memories that no one wanted to hear anymore. Her name associated not with prestige, but with systematic abuse disguised as charity. Helen, the housekeeper who had been more family than Constance ever was, accepted a position at the foundation running the residential program that provided temporary housing for women fleeing dangerous situations. She brought decades of wisdom and a grandmother's fierce protectiveness, creating a space that felt safe and warm rather than institutional and cold. "You did what none of the others could," Helen told Julia during a quiet moment in the foundation's kitchen. "You broke the cycle. You exposed the pattern. You made sure no more girls would be groomed and married and destroyed by that family. That matters more than you probably realize." The relationship between Julia and Dan evolved naturally over months of partnership, their connection deepening without dramatic declarations or pressure to move faster than felt right. They had dinner together most evenings, sometimes at restaurants, but more often in Dan's penthouse kitchen where they cooked side by side and talked about everything from foundation strategy to childhood memories to dreams neither had voiced before. One evening, while chopping vegetables for a pasta dish Dan was attempting to perfect, Julia found herself laughing at a story he told about his first failed investment, a restaurant that collapsed within months because he knew nothing about the food industry. The sound of her own laughter surprised her, genuine joy bubbling up without the immediate fear that it would be criticized or dismissed. Dan paused in his cooking to watch her, his expression soft with affection that required nothing from her in return. "I like hearing you laugh," Dan said simply. "It reminds me that happiness is supposed to be easy, not something you earn through constant vigilance." Those small moments built trust more effectively than any grand gesture could have. Daily proof that Dan meant what he said about partnership and equality. He never raised his voice when they disagreed about foundation strategy. He never made her feel foolish for asking questions or challenging his assumptions. He never kept score of who contributed more or demanded gratitude for supporting her dreams. Dan told her about his own past, growing up poor in a neighborhood where success seemed impossible, building his wealth through relentless work and strategic risks that could have destroyed him if they failed. He understood hunger in ways Vernon never would, knew what it meant to fight for everything you achieved, rather than assuming it was owed by virtue of birth. His respect for Julia came from recognizing her resilience rather than pitying her vulnerability, seeing her as someone who had survived storms that would have sunk people with less strength. They were sitting on Dan's terrace, watching the city lights blur into stars, when he finally asked the question Julia had been both hoping for and dreading. Their relationship existing in comfortable ambiguity that would eventually need definition. "I want to be with you," Dan said quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness between their chairs. "Not as friends or colleagues or housemates who happen to share space. I want a real relationship with you, Julia, but only if that is something you want too. Only if you are ready for something that is yours by choice rather than circumstance or gratitude." Julia turned to look at him, moonlight casting his face in shadows that made his expression difficult to read, but his sincerity impossible to doubt. She thought about Vernon, about years spent in a relationship where she was never quite enough, never quite right, always aware of being tolerated rather than celebrated. She thought about the fear that had kept her frozen in that marriage long past when love died. Terror of being alone mixing with conviction that she did not deserve better. "I am afraid," Julia admitted, her voice steady despite the confession. "I am afraid that I do not know how to be in a healthy relationship, that I will keep waiting for cruelty disguised as care, that I will make myself small out of habit, even when you have never asked me to shrink. I am afraid that loving you will feel like owing you. That partnership will transform into debt no matter how much you promise equality." Dan squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm that felt grounding and gentle. "Those fears make sense given what you survived. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly or believe promises just because I make them. I'm asking you to try with me, to build something new together where we both get to be fully ourselves without diminishment or obligation. If it feels wrong or controlling, or like I am Vernon in a better disguise, you can walk away, and I will accept that without making you feel guilty for prioritizing your well-being." The honesty of his offer moved something in Julia's chest. Permission to be uncertain without being dismissed. Space to heal without being rushed. Relationship framed as collaboration rather than rescue. She leaned across the space between their chairs and kissed him softly, tasting possibility and hope and the terrifying exhilaration of choosing something for herself rather than accepting what circumstances delivered. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Yes to trying, to building something real together, to believing that maybe I deserve love that does not require me to disappear into someone else's shadow." Their relationship unfolded with careful intentionality. Dan respecting boundaries Julia set, while she learned to trust that care without strings actually existed. He celebrated her foundation successes without taking credit, supported her decisions without trying to control them, loved her loudly enough that she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Months passed in a haze of foundation growth and personal healing. Julia discovering who she was when not defined by Vernon's cruelty or the Williams family's expectations. The community center where she taught became a satellite location for foundation programming, young women benefiting from resources Julia wished had existed when she needed them most. She stood before classes sharing her story, answering questions about how to recognize abuse patterns, encouraging them to trust their instincts when relationships felt wrong, even if they could not articulate exactly why. During one particularly powerful session, a young woman named Keisha raised her hand and asked the question that haunted so many people trapped in toxic relationships. How do you know when to leave? My boyfriend says he loves me, but he gets angry when I spend time with friends. He says it is because he wants me all to himself, that it proves how much he cares. Is that normal? Julia sat on the edge of the desk, meeting Keisha's eyes directly. Love never isolates. Real love wants you to have friends and family and interests beyond the relationship, because healthy people understand that you need community and support. When someone cuts you off from everyone who cares about you, they are not protecting your relationship. They are making sure you have nowhere to go when they start treating you badly. That is not love. That is control. She watched understanding dawn across Keisha's face, saw the girl's expression shift from confusion to clarity as pieces clicked into place. After class, Keisha approached with tears streaming down her face, asking for resources about restraining orders and safe places to stay. Julia connected her with foundation services, and 6 months later, Keisha returned as a volunteer, helping other young women recognize patterns she wished she had identified sooner. You are not being too sensitive, Julia told a different girl whose boyfriend constantly criticized her appearance while claiming it was for her own good. You are not overreacting. You are not lucky that someone loves you despite your flaws. Those are lies abusers tell to make you doubt your own reality. Love that requires you to accept disrespect is not love at all. The words were ones Julia wished someone had said to her years ago. Permission to believe her instincts, rather than second-guessing every uncomfortable feeling Vernon provoked. She gave that gift to every young woman who walked through the foundation's doors or sat in her classes. Validation that their feelings mattered and their boundaries deserved respect. Chapter 10. The Wedding and the Resurrection. The sunrise dress Julia wore on her wedding day caught light like liquid gold. Elegant simplicity, replacing the elaborate gown she had worn for Vernon. A declaration that this marriage was built on completely different foundations. The community center where she had found purpose during her darkest days had been transformed into something magical. Flowers and candles creating warmth that had nothing to do with expensive displays and everything to do with genuine celebration. Dan waited at an altar constructed from reclaimed wood. His expression when he saw Julia walking toward him, making her breath catch with wonder at being looked at like she was the answer to questions he had been asking his entire life. No hesitation lived in his eyes, no doubt that she was exactly who he wanted beside him for whatever came next. Helen stood beside Julia as matron of honor, this woman who had been more mother than employee, whose fierce love had sustained Julia through years of Constance Williams's calculated cruelty. The gathering represented a collision of worlds that would have horrified Vernon's mother. Successful professionals mixing with former clients of the foundation. Wealthy donors sitting beside women who had escaped abuse with nothing but determination and the resources Julia's foundation provided. This was not marriage as social performance or dynasty preservation. This was commitment witnessed by people who understood that love meant expansion rather than contraction, partnership rather than ownership. I promise to see you clearly, Dan said when vows were exchanged, his voice steady and sure. To celebrate your strength without diminishing it, to support your dreams without trying to direct them, to love you as you are, rather than some version I wish you would become. I promise partnership between equals, collaboration rather than control, a relationship where we both get to be fully ourselves without apology or diminishment. Julia spoke her own vows through tears that blurred her vision but not her certainty. I promise to trust that love can be healthy, that care does not require debt repayment, that choosing each other daily is stronger than childhood promises made by people who did not understand what they were committing to. I promise to bring my whole self, rather than edited versions designed not to threaten or inconvenience. I promise to believe I deserve everything you offer, rather than constantly waiting for it to be taken away. The kiss that sealed their marriage felt like beginning rather than culmination. First breath of new life rather than final chapter of old story. The reception transformed into celebration of survival and transformation. Speakers telling stories about how the foundation had changed their trajectories, given them resources to escape and rebuild, reminded them they were never the problem despite years of being told otherwise. Julia stood at the microphone during dinner, looking out at faces that represented her journey from devastation to triumph, and found words that felt true in ways nothing she said during her first marriage ever had. 2 years ago, I believed my worth was measured by how successfully I could erase myself to accommodate someone else's ego. I believed gratitude and love were the same thing, that being chosen meant being owned, that leaving would prove I was as ungrateful and inadequate as I had been told. Tonight I stand before you married to someone who sees my strength as gift rather than threat, who celebrates my voice rather than silencing it, who understands that real love makes both people bigger rather than requiring one person to shrink. She looked at Dan, finding him watching her with pride so profound it made her throat tighten. The party continued until dawn, painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, guests departing with full hearts and renewed hope. Julia and Dan drove to the airport as sun climbed over city skylines, beginning a honeymoon that felt earned rather than expected, celebration of something real rather than performance of something hollow. The foundation thrived in their absence, staff running programs Julia designed with competence that proved she had built something sustainable. Women found refuge, legal representation, counseling. The work continued, regardless of whether Julia was physically present. Testament to systems she created rather than personality she embodied. Months became years, the foundation expanding to multiple cities, helping thousands escape situations that once seemed inescapable. Julia published a book detailing her journey, sales, funding, foundation programs, and reaching women who needed permission to believe their instincts over their abusers' narratives. Vernon served his sentence in quiet obscurity, his name occasionally appearing in articles about white-collar crime or the downfall of generational wealth families who believed rules applied to others. Constance faded from relevance completely, her attempts to rebuild reputation meeting walls of indifference. The community center expanded programming thanks to foundation funding, young women learning from Julia's example that survival was possible and strength could be built from broken pieces. Dan remained her partner in every sense, their relationship deepening over years into something solid and sustaining, love that expanded rather than constrained. On their 5th anniversary, Julia stood in the foundation's main hall, surrounded by photographs documenting hundreds of success stories, women who escaped and rebuilt and thrived. Dan wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling grateful not for being rescued but for being seen, not for being saved but for being valued exactly as she was. "Thank you," Julia whispered, the words encompassing everything she could not articulate about the journey from Vernon's cold breakfast table to this moment of complete belonging. "Thank you for choosing yourself," Dan replied. "You were always magnificent, Julia. I just had the privilege of watching you finally see it too." Julia Angel Arnold looked at her reflection in the glass walls, seeing a woman who was strong and soft simultaneously, someone who survived hell without becoming hardened by it. She was no longer the orphaned child or the diminished wife. She was a woman who knew her worth, demanded respect, and built legacies that mattered. The Queen rose from the ashes of the girl who thought she owed the world gratitude for her existence, and in rising, she lit fires that helped others find their own way home.